everyone. So for number one, I guess I'll just go down the list. So for the first article, which was the culture article, the two things that I took away from it was number one, the distinction between organization culture and organizational culture. So organization culture is, when the organization is a culture that emerges through symbolic interaction, while organizational culture is a more comprehensive view in which culture emerges as human beings interact with each other, and that gives meanings to the symbols around them. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing that I thought was really important from the article was that it said explicitly that rather than trying to give someone or an organization one right concept, it's better to proactively discuss and define key terms and what they mean, so then that can be applied to the organization and to the people involved to, kind of create this shared understanding of what's going on, because I think that was a fault that happened in their personal research. And so then for the Texaco reading, the two things I took away was, number one, the kind of two options that it laid out for developing more exact prescriptive knowledge. So that's to use similar case studies to find effective and specific strategies, which I honestly feel like I did in my research paper, and then to empirically examine the effect of various strategies that were employed in a crisis case, which they kind of delved more into. And then the second thing that I took away from that article was the idea that just because you successfully use a strategy, it does not imply that there was a positive effect on the stakeholders, and you need to find ways other than I did this, look at how I did this, to evaluate how successful it was. So they said that one way to do it is to kind of look at how financially it played out, and kind of the financial benefits that strategy may have brought to the company. And so then in the final article, which was kind of comparing a bunch of crisis communication books, the two things I took away, the first one was kind of more interesting to me than anything. It was the idea that some authors identified crisis management as a PR issue while others didn't, and the fact that all of them touched on communication, but some said that it was kind of irrelevant, and others were like, this is super important. So I think that just kind of shows like the variance in how we understand crisis communication over the years, obviously. And then the big thing I took away from it was the idea that was like kind of seen over and over again in the books that they were reading, and that's the idea that a crisis is a fire that must be put out, implying that it's something that needs to be done right away. Like, you have to address it right away, which makes a lot of sense because that's what we talked about in class. This idea that you can't just like ignore it and it needs to be addressed right away. So then for question number two, when I think about what I learned in this semester and how it applies to school as well as in my future career, one of the things I think about first is culture and how it's an important concept for being a student, a coworker, a human in the world. And you can look at, as a student, it's important to understand culture and, to understand the culture of Mizzou or to understand culture in a specific classroom, as well as taking what you understand about culture to, the real world or like whatever job I'm going to have in the future, to understand and identify the culture of my department or even the organization as a whole, because my goal is to work with others and to help others in some capacity. I don't know how, but with having human interaction, there's gonna be some kind of culture. And I think that for me personally, in the past, whenever I had a job I didn't realize how much the culture was impacting why I didn't like my job. And now that I have a firm grasp on what culture is, it's so clear to look in hindsight and be like, wow, the culture was super toxic. And if this one thing were to change, or this one person would have been addressed better, then the culture would have been completely changed. So I think having the tools, even if I'm not in the position to completely change the culture, I think it's important to understand how to change the culture, as well as just being able to identify it in a setting with other people. And then finally, the most eye-opening information that we covered for me is the idea of seeing organizations as communication, as opposed to, the classical view of seeing everyone as kind of this cog in a machine, because that's kind of what everyone's taught and how we all understand it. But then to move away from that to this idea that everything an organization does is a form of communication, and basically that communication is a fundamental process of any organization, is, I think, the basis for everything else we learned in this class. So I thought that was the most important piece of information. And yeah.